while that will be run out of the CU Teach LA offices with Olivia, it'd be great for you to let folks know about those. Are you going to tell Paul? Yeah, why don't you tell Paul? It's a great idea. It would be also nice if faculty let their graduation ceremony people know about that. I'll tell Paul.
Did you just tell us when the physics graduation was?
Nope. Physics graduation. So graduation is next week. Thursday afternoon. APS is at 2 to 5 or something like that, and physics is 4 to 7, I believe. 4 to 6.
Cool. That is 5 to
Midnight. when the keg runs out. Right.
Run 3 hours. Usually.
yeah.
Right. A couple hours.
2 to
Ours is an
3:30.
hour.
Yeah,
Right.
2 to 3.
So, great. So yeah, I mean, I suspect physics might be a long one. We do recognize individuals, but we have folks graduating from this research group in all of those departments. So congrats, graduates. Do please show up to support our graduates there. Graduates, please do go to at least the departmental ceremony.
You guys do all the doc students first, right?
We do the doc students last, second. Yep. Can you pass these down to Valerie? Also, I don't know if anybody else is planning on going, but I'm going to the campus graduation on Friday morning. I like it.
I strongly recommend it. Actually, I did it last year, and it was fun. I've never seen that many people congregated together for an education-related event ever. So,
yeah, how about that? Yeah. And I'm going to be sporting fancy new robes. So if you want to see.
I'm sporting my University of California robe for the first time.
Nice. Okay. So
I'm
Valerie and I throwing down.
I'm going to try to go to it's a 7 a.m., right?
It's, no, I think it's
usually
9-ish.
lineup is then.
Lineup is like 8.
So I'm about to on my calendar.
Yep.
Okay, well,
No, it's a week from Friday. Week from tomorrow. So a week from today. We will not have group meeting a week from today. We will the following week, but so focus on graduations and the like. And if you're burning for stuff to do PER related, take next week's time to organize your PERC abstract, which is coming up due in a month, I believe. So as well as AAPT, lodging registration, all the rest of that is starting to unfold. So keep an eye to those. Any other announcements?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I was listening to NPR earlier, and on Fresh Air today, they had 2 very interesting people they interviewed. One was former Assistant Secretary of Education, Diane Ravitch, in which she explains why she was once an early advocate of No Child Left Behind school vouchers in charter schools and what changed her mind. But then also, interestingly, they had the counterpoint. Too bad these 2 people who were actually speaking to each other, but educational consultant Andrew Rotherham explains why he supports strategies that will redesign American public education with the help of charter schools and teacher accountability. So I thought people would be interested. It's up on the NPR website if you want to find that. It was up today.
Cool.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, and of course, announcement. While you may not be invited, it is a public event. That Charlie's Defense is Monday at 3 o'clock, I believe, somewhere up here. So whether or not he invites you, you're welcome to go. It should be great. Okay, so with that, it's great to have one member of the Charles, Melissa, Chandra team leave, Chandra, and another arrive, Melissa. Charles, you're next. No. Everybody comes home. Anyway, would it be helpful? I mean, our group has grown and changed since last we've been here. Do you want us to introduce ourselves briefly? That would be great. Okay, so I will unusually start. I'm Noah, F, and in the PR group.
Bethany Wilcox, grad student physics.
Steve Pollock, me.
Lauren Kosmith, grad student physics.
Ben Spike, grad student physics.
Charles Bailey, grad student physics.
I'm Ben Zwickle. I'm a postdoc in physics.
Ian Caldwell, undergrad physics.
I'm Emily Moore. I'm a postdoc with Beck.
Rich McNamara, unemployed physics, high school physics teacher.
Modeler.
Oh, modeler.
Sorry, Noah. No.
That's okay. I'm Noah, a researcher for Beck.
I'm Kelly Lancaster, and I'm a postdoc with Beck.
Valerie O'Carroll, School of Ed.
Jenny Knight, molecular cell developmental biology.
Robert Carson, faculty chemistry, also with Beck.
Seth Ornstein, astronomy.
Stephanie Chastain, postdoc physics.
Ann Barry Hunter, ethnography and evaluation research.
Ed Johnson, independent contractor.
Rachel Pepper, postdoc in physics. Oh, I'm Chandra Turpin. Graduated here a year ago and doing a postdoc with Charles Henderson.
And I'm Melissa, faculty here.
Charles, I'm faculty at Western Michigan University.
And you have to speak up in this room because of the ambient noise.
Yeah.
And because we're old and beef.
So, just want to give a little bit of introduction, and I'm going to pass it off to Charles and Chandra to tell you a little bit more. You all, I know, or most of you have heard us talk, and if you've been around for a couple of years, you've heard multiple talks about the project. We've been working together for a number of years on sort of the big question of how do you bring about change, primarily at the university level in terms of teaching. So we know that the NSF spends a ton of money on curriculum development, and then there's a lot of effort at dissemination. But we also know that for the most part, most instruction still remains traditional. And so sort of what underlines our research is trying to understand more about that. Why, despite all this time and effort, do we not see a lot of impact? And then to follow up on that, the larger goal of what kind of model would work, because this developed curriculum disseminated out model doesn't seem to work very well. So what might we do that would be able to bring about change in higher education and science education a little bit better? So we're going to talk today about a project, and you all have heard many aspects of it. We're going to not talk too much about those, and we're actually here. Charles and Chandra are here. They've been here for a few days. This is our research retreat, so we've been trying to get some new papers out and deal with data and work on that. And we want to share with you some of that stuff that we're sort of trying to make sense of and get with. So the basics of the project, we did a web survey where we got 722 faculty that responded in ways that allowed us to use the data, where we asked them about all kinds of stuff, all the stuff you might imagine. What did they know about? What were they using? You know, what was some of the climate in their department? What were their goals? So we were able to do some statistical analysis of that. And there's several papers from this that have already been published. And then we followed that up with the second phase, which was to interview a subset of those faculty who fell into one of two groups. They either had experiences with peer instruction, where they claimed on the survey that they used peer instruction. They said that they want to use peer instruction, or they claimed to know about it but not use it. And then the same thing with workshop physics, that they were current users of it, former users of it, or they're familiar with it but they didn't use it. We picked these two here, the peer instruction and workshop physics. Peer instruction because it's the most commonly, right from our survey, it was the one that people were most likely to know about and use. It's also one of the least intrusive, like it fits very well with traditional instruction, which is most certainly not unrelated to why it's known about and used quite a bit. Workshop physics was one of the probably the most radical sort of innovation that we asked about on the survey. But it also had a significant number of people who knew about it and used it. So we had enough people that were workshop physics users in order to go in and talk to them. So we did these interviews and we asked all kinds of stuff about what they were doing, why they were doing it, what their experiences were, what they thought of all the stuff that they were doing. And many of
we're using the survey data, and one of the questions that we're interested in is if you think about a typical model of how people implement something new, Rogers' model is probably the most common. So you learn about it, you somehow develop an attitude about it, you try it, and then if you like it, you keep using it. And so one of the things we're interested in is in terms of using PER-based instructional innovations, where do people fall off of this process? And so if we map this onto our survey, we can look at various points here. So one of the things we asked faculty about in the survey is which of these research-based instructional strategies do you know about, which of them do you use? So we've got the knowledge phase. We categorize these as people that know about one or more of these strategies versus people that say that they don't know about any of these. We don't really have much information about these effective things. What do you think about them? We have that more through the interviews, but we do have whether they say that they use it. And then we also have what they say about their current level of use of these things. And so the first question is, well, just where are the holes in the pipeline? And if you look at this, well, we see we lose some people here. They just have never heard about these things. There's another group of people, 16%, that have heard about these, at least one of these, but haven't tried any of them. It turns out that the biggest problem here are people that have tried them, but have stopped using any of them. So, I mean, there's some people that try, say peer instruction, and then they stop using peer instruction and use something else, like, something more radical, like workshop physics or something. These aren't the people that we're talking about. These are the people that tried at least something and don't use any of these instructional strategies anymore. And so when you look at it, if you take this, approximately 75% of the people who have tried these things, about a third of those stop using them. So this is a big hole. The last thing that we do is we categorize them between what we call high users and low users, and that I'll talk about that a little bit later. The numbers aren't really important here because we broke it down to split roughly in half. High users we defined as people who said they use 3 or more innovations together. Low users used 1 or 2 innovations together. So we find, well, this is where this discontinuing after trying is a big hole. The other thing that we wanted to know is we have some information about what's related to people in each of these categories and each of these 4 stages of the innovation decision process. And so from the survey information, we came up with 20 variables that might explain the difference between people who are in each of the 2 groups. So we have people who know about things versus people who don't. We have people who tried versus people who don't. People who are current users, they're continuing versus people who have given up, former users, and then high versus low users. And so of these 20 variables, 10 of them are significant at some point. And we looked at significance in 2 different ways. So these X's, and I'll tell you what these variables mean in a minute, because I know they're cryptic. These X's mean that they were significant by themselves. So just in a simple ANOVA or chi-squared for some types of variables is, in this case, attending is have you attended 1 or more talks or workshops related to teaching in the last year. That's what this variable measures. And so that's significant individually for all of these categories, attending talks and workshops related to teaching. The pluses mean, so after we looked at these individual variables, we dumped these variables that were significant in a logistic regression model. And the variables that have a plus by them were also significant in that logistic regression model. So they were significantly correlated. Now, I'll show you some graphs in a bit to show you how they were related. But for now, these are, so what we find here is attending talks and workshops related to teaching. That is significant individually all across the board, but only once you control for all the other variables, only in developing knowledge and distinguishing between high and low users. The institution is the type of institution that they work at. So is it an institution that has a PhD in physics, a bachelor's degree in physics, or is it a 2-year college? Not significant once controlling for other variables. Have you been to the Physics and Astronomy New Faculty Workshop? That's significant in our model for developing knowledge and encouraging people to try. This RDIS, what that's measuring is self-reported interest in using more research-based instructional strategies. And so you can see that that's important in determining between people who have tried versus, and also in determining current users from former users. The gender variable was significant, so females are more likely to be current users and are more likely to be high users than males. People who regularly read education-related journals are more likely to know about things and try them. Position, this is whether they're full-time permanent faculty members or some other part-time or temporary or some other type of position. That's significant in terms of knowledge. And satisfaction with meeting instructional goals and specifically conceptual understanding of problem solving is significant at this point here in knowledge. Let me point out several variables that are interesting that they're not significant anywhere. One of them is we have 3 measures of research productivity. This one, these 3 research measures. One was talks and papers that they've given in their research area in the last 2 years. One was talks, one was papers, and one was grants. None of those are significant with respect to this group membership. We have their job, what percentage of your job is related to teaching? Is it 50% or more or less than 50%? Not significant. Years of teaching experience, not significant. Class size, not significant. So a lot of things that we often think are significant don't show up in these models as being significant. So let me show you a little bit about the weight of these variables. And I'm going to go through and look at the new faculty workshop variable because this is the one that varies most significantly among the 4 groups.
Do folks have questions on this slide so far? Because there's a lot in this
I'm
one.
sorry,
Yeah.
I've been talking fast and furious.
What? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to make sure I understood. So X means significant, X plus means more significant,
X
Y
means
means
that variable is significant by itself.
Okay, great.
And X plus means that variable is significant once we've controlled for the
As
other
part of
variables
the regression.
in a logistic regression model.
And the high users versus low users, those are people who are still currently using the techniques, not people who were once high and low users but are now falling
That's
out
right,
of the pipeline.
yeah. So these are everybody that's in either high or low use are current users.
Yeah.
Some of them use more, some of them use less.
Okay. Can you remind me what AT&D was?
That is attending talks and workshops related to teaching. So have they attended a talk or workshop in the last 2 years or have they not? Anything else? Thanks for slowing me down.
I guess attending talks and workshops, that could have a range of intensity.
Absolutely. So this is all the way from
Going to a week-long workshop versus going to a talk once.
absolutely. Yeah, this is all the way from I went to a 2-week workshop to learn about workshop physics to I was at an APS meeting and I attended a talk about peer instruction there. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's hidden underneath these.
And the new faculty workshop would be included in that.
No.
It depends on how the person would read that variable. We didn't word the question, have you attended talks or workshops, except for the new faculty workshop. So that may also be included in there for some people. But we did ask specifically about the new faculty workshop separately. So it's unclear how somebody who had been to the new faculty workshop would answer that question.
But you could,
There's ways that we might be able to dig into it.
you could just remove all the people that went to the new faculty workshop and rerun it and see.
Well, but somebody who's been to the new faculty workshop has probably also done other things. I mean, it's very likely that they've gone to other things.
Right, but if you did it on the population that did attend the new faculty workshop, then you would see, from that population that didn't actually get to have that experience, how did workshop and conferences impact that other population.
So in theory, the regression analysis should have done that, right? Because it would have looked comparative to the new faculty workshop.
What, Connor? Melissa?
I was saying, actually, it's a question for Charles, I guess. The regression analysis would have done that because it would have said, if it was correlated with the new faculty workshop, then it would have eliminated it.
No, the problem is that I think what you're saying the problem is that there's some ambiguity in people who say I've attended a talk or workshop in the last 2 years, whether they would include the new faculty workshop in that or whether they would not include the new
I think
faculty
the
workshop.
problem is you're confounding that variable with the new faculty workshop. If in fact the new faculty workshop is as important as you say it is, or some of your other work has said it is, then that attending talks or workshops is already included by those possibilities.
But it just might be that's the key workshop, and if you look at people that didn't go to that workshop, then you find out that attending workshops doesn't really.
No. Then what Melissa said is exactly correct. I mean, these are, people in here may have been going to the new faculty workshop, but people in here definitely had gone to the new faculty workshop. So we can control, I mean, the logistic regression model controls for the people who have been to the new faculty workshop, some of which may have claimed that they've been to other workshops. I suspect that most people who have been to the new faculty workshop have also had other experiences so that they would legitimately be in those two groups. But the logistic regression should
We
control.
can move on.
that.
Let's just,
Yeah.
What is RDIS?
This is, do they have an interest in using more research-based instructional strategies? So it's kind of their sort of motivation to do more.
And a nod to the Princess Bride.
Sure.
No, I'm finding that a little confusing. So that's they state that they are interested in using research-based materials.
Using more.
Yes.
Using more.
That is, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a motivation, interest sort of thing.
So somebody who's not interested, they're content. They're doing. I mean, if they're in any of these other categories like tried
That's
or
right. Yeah, so
current
they may be
user,
a- they may be
they've
a
found
current-
something, they're using it, but they're not interested in finding anything new.
Yeah, exactly. So they may be a current user and be content, in which case they would say no. Or they may be a current user and want to do something different. They may be a low user and want to use more. It's so similar. Yeah.
So what does that mean in the knowledge versus no knowledge category? I mean, their interest, they want to try something new, but they just don't know what the new things are, or?
Yeah, so that would mean, well, I know about a lot of these research-based instructional strategies, and I'd like to use either, some of the people in the knowledge group don't use any, some do use some. So either I don't use any and I want to use some, or I use some and I want to increase my use of them. Could mean a variety of things depending on which of these higher groups they end up in.
Are you saying that for the people who aren't really familiar with any of these strategies, saying that they're not interested in using more is not that meaningful in some
Right.
way?
No,
If
I-
they don't know what
yeah,
it
I
is
was
that
just
they're
saying-
not using.
Yeah.
I wouldn't expect,
Right.
not knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why would you have an interest if you don't even know what we're talking about?
Yeah, so that's kind of a funny interpretation for
For
this
that
group.
group.
But notice there were very few people that actually,
Well, so you told us about everything except ENC and peer, so you might as well
okay,
fill out
sure.
the insignificant
and actually
rows.
these are actually interesting. I'm glad you mentioned them. So encouragement is their self-reported level of perceived departmental encouragement for improving teaching, which didn't show up anywhere.
Really?
Yeah.
Institutional encouragement has no statistically significant impact on any of the categories.
As reported in surveys.
Yeah, exactly.
So most of them reported being
And that's, what is
encouraged,
this one
actually.
institution?
How about discouragement?
The hard thing about this variable is that almost everybody, as Melissa was trying to say, almost everybody said that their departmental supported instructional improvement.
Oh, I see. So you got no correlations because everybody just said
Yeah.
everybody was in that bin. So
Yeah, I
there's
mean,
no.
not everybody, but like 80%. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of people were
So
there.
that could be a necessary condition, in fact, but we don't know.
But then
We
when we talk to them in the interviews, and I don't know if Chandra's going to talk about this later, but when you talk to them in the interviews and ask them about departmental encouragement, it basically means they say that the department is encouraging as long as they don't get in the way of doing stuff. And most of them were like, well, yeah, I can do whatever I want to, and as long as nobody complains to the department chair, it's fine. That's their definition of encouragement. So yeah, some of these are.
And most of them, if you push them to give concrete ways in which you're supported by your department, they actually say, well, it's not actually that I get concrete support, it's actually that they just don't get in my way. Yeah.
The last variable is peers, which is the frequency with which they talk to colleagues about teaching. And so that goes from, could be multiple times a week down to never. That didn't come up, we were talking about that the other day. One of the reasons that We think that that may not be important here, is that we asked about the frequency rather than the content of those discussions. And so while the frequency, you could talk very often, but about non-important things, or you could talk very seldom about very important things. And that may be why it doesn't show up that we would expect it to show up in the model. Let me move on a little bit here. So for each of these variables that were significant, we wanted to know not only that they were significant, but in what way they were significant. And so we developed a series of odds ratios here. And I'll just look at the new faculty workshop one. And so what this means, the odds ratio are the odds, if you look at the knowledge group, you can take the odds of people who have been to the new faculty workshop versus people who haven't. So, five people have been to the new faculty workshop, 4 haven't. So you've got a 5 to 4 odds of having been to the new faculty workshop. And you compare that to the odds in the non-user group. And you take the ratio. What's the odds of the user group versus the odds of the non-user group? For the new faculty workshop, just looking at the new faculty workshop variable, the odds are 15 to 1, or the odds are 15 to 2. Controlling for the other variables that adjust that down to about 10. So the odds of going to the new faculty, the odds of people in the knowledge group that have been to the new faculty workshop compared to people who haven't is 10 times greater than that for the no knowledge group. And you can see that that's by far, comparing knowledge to no knowledge, is by far the largest thing there. The important thing about these odds is that if the odds are not, if the error bars on our odds don't overlap with 1, meaning that the odds could be identical with the two groups, then we probably have a significant variable there. And so you can see that the new faculty workshop variable is highly significant. Our error bars go off much higher than the graph on the positive side. Not very interesting. And again, what you can see here is developing knowledge.
Charles, why are the error bars so big on that?
Yeah.
We don't know.
I can't tell you. Yeah, I think what that is telling us is that there's a lot of unexplained things in our model, but I can't tell you for sure why they're so big or if it's weird that they're so big. To be honest, I can't tell.
What's important about it is that we know it's statistically different from 1, and there's just a lot of uncertainty in the actual value of the ratio.
But there's a big difference between 10 times and 2 times.
Yeah,
Both
that's true.
are within
Yeah.
the uncertainty. So
Yeah.
Yeah. And so,
I just wanted to know, what's driving it? Because it seems kind of odd.
Yeah, I can't tell you. And again, as Melissa said, we're putting this stuff together now. So, I put these charts together just a couple of days ago for the first time. So these questions are really helpful in helping us just figure out how to describe them in our paper. But you can see the way that people know about these things is they go to traditional dissemination mechanisms. They go to the new faculty workshop, they attend talks and workshops, and they read about stuff. So the stuff that we do in PER, we give talks and workshops, we write books, and
I think actually this full time, the position is also important in the sense that you have time in this environment to continue to work on professional development. You stay in the same kind of field. I think this idea.
Yes.
I think that's
Yes.
this idea of longevity is important too.
Yeah, so you've got some incentive to put some effort into it. So watch this new faculty workshop line as I jump to the next piece here, which is try versus not try. Still super significant, but the odds ratios drop down quite a bit. So the new faculty workshop is very helpful in motivating people to try these things.
Why are you doing odds ratios?
We have categorical data, so we can't do like a linear regression model, which would be more common. And so that's the best way that we figured out to describe these differences.
Just try to communicate the scale of it.
No, I understand. Right. Yeah, I was just sort of doing some thinking and trying to think about other things. So non-categorical. Otherwise, we've done Man Whitney, just comparative tests and categories. I don't want to derail you, but this is the stuff. Since you thought about how am I presenting this, I thought.
Yeah, we want to.
This is actually compelling. You're 7 times as likely to try versus not try, except for the error bars.
Yeah, we wanted to have a way to convey this strength, and this was the best that we came up with. they may be better.
In the meeting, like when you get the numbers out of the regression, I was having a hard time with the exam. Like, what does it mean? Like you get this number 0.3 and you're like, what does that mean?
Man-Whitney's not a bad idea
to
though.
understand that.
At some point, we weren't using Man-Whitney because we didn't have just dichotomous groups that we were, so two rank-ordered groups that we were comparing. We had 4, but now we do have this dichotomous.
That might also help you with the error bars, would be another way to triangulate too. Anyway, so I mean, there are various tests, and I like this. I'm just trying to think about what community does. And this is actually, to be honest, this is also a soft test, isn't it?
Soft test, I'm not sure.
The odds test is a soft statistical test. It's easier to get positive results out of than other kinds of tests.
I think that's true, but that's not, I mean, these odds come out of the logistic regression.
Oh, right, yeah.
So it's not just like calculating odds and then comparing them.
And so
So it's
I mean,
different than
these are 95% confidence bars in that statistical model. So we think that we're 95% confident that correct, yeah.
So your peer variable there, that was talking to peers. That's suggesting that we are terrible at convincing our colleagues to use these methods.
Well, not really. I mean, that could be part of it.
We're not going to listen to what you say.
The reason I put that in there is because there's a lot of talk. Well, if you have a department that's constantly talking with one another about their teaching, that those people are perhaps more likely to be interested in teaching and look for new instructional strategies. So that was more what that was, rather than, well, there's a person in the group that does PER and they're talking to other people about it. I mean, that will probably be included there, but that's not what we.
So is the frequency then affecting that? I mean, you have twice. Is it twice a week? Is pretty often to be.
Well, it's greater than or equal to weekly versus less than weekly. So if you do it once a week or more versus less than once a week, it doesn't. It's 1.
We also don't have a lot of information about, like, what he was saying, the nature of these conversations. So if I have to coordinate with the lab instructor every week, like they may say I'm talking with my peers about teaching, but it's like logistics. It's not like a substantive discussion about our goals or how we should go about doing what we do.
Yeah. So in terms of convincing your colleagues to use this, which is kind of what you're looking at, you'd want to know about how often have you discussed with a colleague? I guess you're saying what you're talking about, or have you ever discussed with a colleague? It doesn't seem like the frequency is really all that important, but have you ever gone to a colleague and asked them about what they do in their classroom?
Yeah, I mean, that could be something that we could ask. We didn't ask that question. We asked how often do you talk with your colleagues about teaching, and we have a range of responses. And as we said, those discussions are a lot of different things. Anyway, there's different models of how these things might spread through the department. One is, well, I have somebody who knows something and I go out and I tell other people about it. But the other model is that it comes from interactive discussions within people in the department and not, one person telling somebody else.
But we don't know that latter.
We don't.
I suspect that would show up more in terms of how people use it and support for using it rather than trying it.
Yeah, and we know nothing about this now, except that it's very common for people to say, well, departments that talk a lot about teaching are more innovative. And it's not that simple, is what we can clearly say.
We do actually have more. The interviews shed light on this in a very interesting way that Chandra will talk about.
But this doesn't, let me think, this doesn't tell you, I mean, this just says that the odds are equal that you would try or not try when you converse with.
So if you look at a group of triers,
it doesn't tell you about frequency. It's just odds are different than frequency.
So if you look at a group of triers and you look at a group of non-triers, the odds that the person in there has talked a lot versus talked a little with their colleagues is the same in both groups. That's what that's telling us.
Yeah.
So it does tell us that just knowing how frequently somebody, at least within these two dichotomous variables, just knowing how frequency one talks with
that
their
doesn't
colleagues
increase
doesn't help you determine whether they're in one group or another. So moving on to the continue versus not continue. If we continue to look at the new faculty workshop, here the new faculty workshop effect goes away. So the new faculty workshop it makes a huge difference in developing knowledge and convincing people to try. It doesn't help them at all to continue, which we suspect means that these people get really excited, they go back, things don't work out so well, and they pull back from.
So we need an old faculty workshop?
Yes.
Yeah,
Really old.
well,
curmudgeonly
so one
faculty.
idea is an old faculty workshop, but the other thing is one of the standard features of traditional dissemination is we tell people about it and we motivate them, but we don't help them once they try. Yeah, we don't support them. We don't develop the professional development to give them a realistic understanding of the burdens the barriers they're going to face when they try to implement. And so we suspect that all of these things like going to talks and workshops, reading about stuff, going to the new faculty workshop, are all based on this model of telling and motivating, not supporting. So that's a problem. Here, the other thing that's interesting here is the gender variable starts to become significant. So women are, about the odds of being female are about twice as large for the continuing group versus not continuing. So we were talking about this morning. We suspect that there's something about being some other personality characteristics that correlate with being female that make it more likely to persevere, to value these things enough to persevere with them.
I could be wrong about
Probably.
previous research that...
Never!
Exactly. But about previous research that you've talked about that people that have attended new faculty workshops are more likely to be using PER products.
That's right, yeah.
So does this imply then that those people that were surveyed for those particular studies were early users? Were just early users and not people who are using?
No, it's a different comparison that we're making here, though. So we're saying, does attending the new faculty workshop help you persevere versus not persevere? Is basically what this question is asking.
I see.
Not does it help you initially try. So in that previous slide, the people, if you look at our...
No, I mean previous work where you talked about how, where we found, I felt that our community has demonstrated that there is a correlation between people who are using
Right.
Innovative methods and people who and having attended the new faculty workshop. It seems to me that the data that you just showed says, oh, well, those people were just first-time users and they never did it again.
Valerie, because the data he was just showing of the continue versus not continue, that's only based on people who have tried, right? So you're only in that if you've gotten as far as trying.
It's a subset of these triers, and so between trying and not trying, it was very, very significant when going to the new faculty workshop. Now we're looking between continuing and not continuing. So we're still using a subset of these people who have tried it. And so if we were to, so you're wanting to compare the continued use to, I'm not even sure what that comparison would be, but you're
I don't know. I mean, I was all
comparison.
excited saying, oh my God, the new faculty workshops are so important, we got to replicate it all over the place. And now it just seems like what's being said here is, oh, it's great to get people to try it, but it doesn't last very long.
Well, that's not what we're saying.
Effect on whether or not they.
Exactly. Yeah,
It has no
yeah.
effect on if they continue.
That's right. Yeah. So
It's not the deciding factor about whether you continue.
Exactly.
Other things
Yeah.
But if you don't
will
try in
take
the
over
first
now.
place, you're not going to continue.
Yeah.
It has no effect on whether or not they continue.
So it helps them to try. It helps them to try it. Some of the people, 2/3 of the people who try it do continue.
Yeah, roughly.
About 2/3.
Once they're in this
And so presumably a lot of those people have been to the new faculty workshop. I mean, we can look at that variable separately for that, but it's not declaiming all the value of the new faculty workshop, which I think is pretty significant.
Yeah. Charlotte?
No, I think maybe the next slide is probably going to answer my.
So high versus low. Again, if we look at the new faculty workshop, it makes no difference between high and low users. The gender variable is still significant. High users are more likely to be female. Going to talks, attending talks and workshops is the highest thing here. What we suspect this is
But
just
that's
saying.
correlation, or maybe, I mean,
Yes.
I mean, if you're a high user, you may need to do that, or
Right.
be doesn't imply that going to that attending is what makes you a high user.
No, that's
it's
right.
probably more likely that being a high user makes you attend.
Yeah, that's what we're going to say. Is that what this is probably telling us is that people who are interested in being high users continue to develop their skills about these things, which is why you see such a large difference here between the people who attend these talks and workshops versus somebody who started using peer instruction 10 years ago and still uses it exactly the same way, maybe a low user and doesn't attend anything, basically. Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you said this before, but there were PER faculty in the survey, the 70.
The 722 faculty, we specifically eliminated any school that had developed one of these research-based instructional strategies, which will kill, like here, it'll kill a lot of PER faculty. We didn't ask them about the research specialty, so it is possible that there's PER faculty in this survey, but we would expect them to be underrepresented compared to the national population of PER faculty because we eliminated a lot of schools with strong PER programs.
So my thinking was just that, it might skew it in the sense that it reflects more of their habits or what are part of their requirements for work as opposed to what influenced them to be using it or continue using it in the first place.
Yeah,
so
it might. I suspect that we have so few PER faculty in our sample that it wouldn't make any. If we had a large fraction, it would, and we don't know.
Well, we do know from the interviews, which we then randomly sampled, that we didn't get. We got
In the
people that were
sample of
marginally in PER, but no
100,
really big.
there were maybe 2 that were marginally involved. So it's probably on the order of 2% or less.
And then there's also the question of what you consider to be a PER person, because there's a lot of people who, let's say, don't
French.
publish anything in PER, but would consider themselves to be PER people. I don't know what to do. We have no information about that at all. So, are there other questions about this? Because then I'll turn over to Chandra in a second.
Yeah, on the attendance category, is there any way to tease out how much time they've invested in looking at these things? For example, 1 hour talk versus a 1 day workshop versus a 1 week
Yeah,
workshop?
we didn't. We think that's. It's almost certainly an important characteristic of these talks and workshops. It's not something that when we were developing the survey, that was one of the initial things that we were interested in. But there were a lot of other things we were interested in, and we had to cut stuff out of the survey, and that was on the chopping block. So we can't answer that question right now.
When I look at these odds ratios, go back. So up till now, we've been focusing on error bars that are not overlapping with one on the right side, but now I'm seeing a couple that don't overlap with one on the left side.
Well,
so like research 2 and size. So that means that you are statistically significantly less likely to be a high-end user if you are publishing more than 4 articles.
Well, again, that's what the single variables. When we correct for the other variables using the model, that does overlap with one. Again, 95% confidence interval. If we it may be a little bit less than 1, so there may be some significance there that we're not able to
if that ever becomes important, the odds ratio, you want to take the log or something? Because less than 1 should be just as big of a span is bigger than 1 on this graph, shouldn't it?
Yes.
An odds ratio of 0.1 should be just as interesting as an odds ratio of 10.
Yes, absolutely.
So somehow there's a skewing of the scale that
and a
hides
skewing
that.
of the error bars as a result of that.
And you'll notice that, and you're absolutely right that we pushed it so that these were all
you could have just taken the reverse ratios, and we wouldn't.
And that's what we're planning to do. You notice that we did that for most of them. As I said, the data is pretty new. It's a non-trivial. It's trivial to take the reciprocal of this, but to take the reciprocal of the error bars is more complicated.
You made them up anyway.
But yes, that's a good thing for us to do.
Okay, I'm going to go through this really fast because Melissa said some of this already. So from the survey sample, which is the data that Charles just presented, we selected subsamples of those survey respondents to interview. So we contacted 51 faculty about peer instruction and 46 about workshop physics. And on average, we got about between 70 and 75% response rate. And we have interviews with physics faculty about peer instruction and about workshop physics, 35 with each. And we're primarily going to present results on the PI interviews. Those are what we have results done to share, and we're currently starting the work on analyzing the workshop physics interviews.
Do you have does that sample overlap?
No. We intentionally picked distinct people.
So once they're in one category, we didn't pick them from the others.
I mean, we can tell you
No. I just
informally
wonder
there are
if
some
they
people.
use. I mean, the point is if they use workshop physics, they're probably much more likely to be using PI.
So we do have some people. I mean, we ask them in these interviews talk about what your instructional practices are. So we have some subset of people who do workshop physics that do claim to pull questions from Missouri's book and have students vote occasionally. Like there is some overlap in the classroom practices of the workshop physics users and peer instruction people. Okay, and this is just briefly what Melissa said. Peer instruction was the most highly known about instructional strategy in the survey, and workshop physics was also highly known about by 48% of faculty. So we wanted to pick a couple of the instructional strategies that were more widely known about. And then similarly, when we look at reported use across the faculty in the survey, peer instruction was the most highly used instructional strategy, with about 29% of physics faculty claiming to use peer instruction. And workshop physics was only about 7%, but we felt like it was one of the more radical reforms that required a complete restructuring, and we were interested in what barriers are encountered when people try to make more radical changes in the structure.
The highest ranked radical.
Right, the highest ranked radical change to the traditional structure. So in our interviews, they were semi-structured, so all three of us conducted the interviews, and we all had guidelines of questions to follow, but we were able to jump around in the interview to target the questions whenever they seemed most appropriate, ask spontaneous follow-up questions as we felt they were relevant or as we wanted people to expand. They were conducted over the phone. They lasted between 1 and 2 hours, and then we audio record them and then transcribe them following the interviews. So a lot of the questions in the interviews were about how did you learn about this instructional strategy? If I was watching your class, what would I see you doing? So can you describe your instructional practices for us? How and why did you start using the strategy? Then after we asked them to describe their instructional practices more broadly, we asked them more specific questions that were specific to the innovation. So Missouri suggests that you have students vote individually before you have them discuss. Were you aware of that suggestion, and is that something that you do or don't do, and why? And then we asked them details about their institutional and departmental context. So this is where we asked them, how supportive is your department or institution of you changing the way you teach? And then that usually was followed by, can you give us a concrete example of a way in which your department supports you changing your teaching? Those kinds of questions. We then, in interviews and in correspondence with Missouri, identified some features of peer instruction that we could characterize in our interviews on a more fine-grained scale. So this is our categorization of how faculty use peer instruction. So we settled on 9 features, which I'm sure we could argue about the 9, but we characterized people who reported to be users of peer instruction, which is shown in the blue, people who reported to be former users of peer instruction, as shown in the red, and non-users shown here in green. And this is the number of PI features that we characterize based on their descriptions that we would say they used.
So the green, the one interview was green 6,
yes,
says I am not a user of PI, but they use 6 of your 9 features.
Yes.
And they just don't call it, they didn't want to call it peer instruction.
Yeah.
So that's a labeling thing.
Sometimes if they were very sophisticated and they knew what peer instruction was, and they knew they had left off 3, they're like, well, but I'm not doing this significant thing. Other people didn't really know what it was, so they'd only be doing a couple, and so they were doing it.
Some people might be using clickers and not have heard of the word peer instruction before. They learned to use clickers from a peer, and then they're using 3 or 5 features out of 9, even though they don't call it peer instruction. So, I mean, part of this is interesting, and part of it, because there isn't actually a really consensus language for talking about these innovations and these practices, which is one of the interesting findings in it. And so on average, the non-users are using about 1 out of 9 features. On average, the former users are using about 4 out of 9, and the users are using 6 out of 9. And so what we did, because we were interested in some correlations in our interview studies, is that we defined our own groups. So now we call the people who use no features, the non-users. The people who use between 7 and 9 features are the high users, and we call everyone in the orange box the mixed users. So they use some pieces or parts of peer instruction, but not a lot. And then we'll use that information, these researcher-assigned categories, to talk about some interesting differences that we see later. So one thing that I wanted us to spend a little bit of time on, and here I'll introduce a little bit about what the features were that we focused on. What do the mixed users, so the people in that orange box, what things do they modify out? And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting is that lots of people think that when faculty modify peer instruction, they're going to modify whether or not they have students discuss. Because some of the hypothesis might be that that sits in tension, most directly sits in tension with some of the things that they're used to doing in their classes. And so what we find is actually in the mixed use group, that's actually used by 60% of the faculty in that mixed use group are actually using the peer discussion part. And we see that there's about 10% that are partly using it. So what that usually means is that some questions they're having them discuss and a lot of other questions they're not. So they're mixed. Sometimes I have them discuss, sometimes I don't. And then this no use, so these are people, so there is about 25% of people who have completely cut the peer discussion element of peer instruction, or of their mixed implementation of peer instruction. And it's interesting also to note, like, what are the things that are most commonly cut? So what's most commonly cut from the mixed users implementation is the commitment to, individual committing to an answer before they talk to each other. So there's actually only about 20% of the mixed users are doing that. Whether or not you use multiple choice questions, so only about 20% of the mixed users are using multiple choice questions. That means they're asking open-ended questions, like, talk to your peer about this problem or about this question, but I'm not going to give you multiple choice answers.
No clickers.
No clickers.
But it could be a calculation. It couldn't be a correct answer. I mean, there can be, right? It's just that it's not.
Yeah, there could be yeah. And so, like, if you look at conceptual questions, that's one part of that, is that 50% of the people are using conceptual questions. And so, I mean, I don't know if they overlap between these two groups, but there's some people who are asking non-multiple choice questions that are conceptually oriented. And then we see that there's, only 10% of people are actually having students commit to an answer after talking with their peers. So the most commonly eliminated features are commit to answer, using multiple choice questions, and then having students commit to an answer after talking to each other. Those are the most commonly dropped features in our mixed user sample. Are there other questions?
All committing to the answer.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's
There's
interesting
no
to think about. Yeah, it's interesting to think about what some of the ramifications would be. In some ways, maybe non-multiple choice questions is good.
Right.
But maybe, like, the drawback from that is that the faculty and the students are potentially getting less feedback, possibly. Like, maybe I have less of a good sense. It also depends on class size, right? If I have a class of 20 people and I feel like I can wander around the room and get a sense of where everyone's at, maybe dropping the voting is less critical. So we don't have a lot of information about how this impacts teaching effectiveness, but we can sort of entertain ideas of how it might impact teaching effectiveness. Yeah?
I find it really interesting that the commit to the answer category is used so infrequently.
Mm-hmm.
And just in your discussions with people, was that primarily because they weren't having people vote individually, or was it because they weren't using multiple choice questions? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because I guess people wouldn't commit to an answer necessarily if you were just going
I think
discuss
it's a
this
combination.
idea.
I think there were some people who were using multiple choice questions that thought that it was too much of a time commitment to have them think individually and discuss. But then there were also people who weren't having them commit to an answer. So there were some people who were using open-ended questions where they did say explicitly, I give students time to think on their own first, and I actually ask them to write something down in their books before I have them talk to each other.
Right.
So some people were doing something that we counted as committing to an answer individually, even if it wasn't multiple choice.
The reason I find that interesting is because I didn't really know until recently how much students valued that individual thinking time and voting time. And recently did a focus interview with, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 students from an upper level biology class, and they all said, we really, really like that we have time to think about the answer on our own, because if we don't, then we feel like we don't get as much of other group discussions. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't know that they valued it.
Yeah, and I've heard people make arguments about why it might be important, but I actually don't know. I don't think a lot of research has been done on these finder grain implementation issues about how it actually impacts effectiveness of instruction.
Yeah.
What was answers not graded again? What does
So
mean?
that was just that whatever responses are given to in-class tasks, are they held accountable? If they get them right or wrong, does that affect their grade? Does getting them right or wrong affect their grade? And actually, I was interested to see, Missouri, that's one thing that he does actually think is important about in-class. His version of peer instruction is that if you get it wrong, there's no ramifications for your grade for getting it wrong. I just want to see.
So,
Yeah.
are all these categories using some kind of electronic vote collection, or?
No.
No. I would say a subset of them are. Some people are using colored cards. Some people are using, a handout that's folded or the back of a book. Some people use Moore's textbook and they point to a letter that's on the back of Moore's textbook.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what fraction are keeping some kind of record.
Yeah. Yeah, and we have identified that. Like, we have written descriptions of their classroom implementation, so we could get that number for you, but we haven't been looking at it as a feature so far.
So I think this is what Steve's getting at. I just need to confirm that you're saying that the answer's not graded, so that they'll hold 2 points for a right answer, 1 point for a wrong answer. Less than 10% of the people are doing that?
Yes. We didn't count if they got participation credit, but the correctness of the answer didn't matter. We didn't count that as grading. So if you just said, like, if you participate in any way, I'm going to give you some points for that. But this is about whether or not the correctness of the answer matters.
And so Missouri stresses, well, if you grade them on it, they're going to give you what they think you think the right answer is versus what they think the right answer is. And so that's why that was an important distinction, at least in Missouri's mind.
But I think there's a lot of local wisdom and here locally and other places about why you might want to make these instructional decisions differently, but we just don't have a lot of research on what the impact of making them different ways might be. Okay, so then the next thing that we looked for in our interviews is what are the perceived affordances and perceived constraints that people see in this innovation? So in peer instruction specifically, what are some things that you think might be strengths? What do you think might be weaknesses? This might be about the strategy itself, or it might be about how the innovation fits in my situation or with my beliefs. So this is the entire group of physics faculty. So this is in our whole sample of 35. The most common perceived affordance of peer instruction is that it's not traditional lecture. So there were a lot of people who basically were just dissatisfied with traditional lecture and said, well, the good thing about peer instruction is that it's not that. And so that was the most prominent reason. The second reason was evidence of effectiveness, personal experience. And this didn't have to be, so there's a couple of interesting things embedded in here. One is that we had a lot of people who moved into using peer instruction in introductory physics from astronomy. So some people had seen it work in their astronomy classes. Some people were saying things like, I know how effective working with my peers can be because that's how I learned everything in graduate school. So that really should work for undergrads too. So there's lots of different kinds of, the sources of this evidence was really varied, but all of them were saying, from some concrete experience I have reason to believe that this would work in the classroom. And so that was, again, more than 50%. Some more of these top reasons are getting students active, departmental support or encouragement actually showed up fairly high. This might be a department chair suggesting that I go to the new faculty workshop. This might be a colleague who shares clicker questions or peer instruction in-class task questions with me, providing okay, so then evidence of effectiveness from data was the fifth most highly graded reason. It makes intuitive sense to me, provides feedback to the instructor, gets students working together, encourages depth of understanding. Students learn by hearing a peer's explanation, or they learn by giving an explanation, and it forces more students to participate. And so these are sort of things that were affordances of peer instruction. And we did the same for constraints. So one of the top perceived constraints was that it requires time and energy to change. And we think that there's a lot embedded in this code that is difficult to unpack in the interviews that we have. Some of that could mean that they don't actually have a good sense of how much time it actually might be required to change. Some of it might mean that if I did have a little bit of extra time, I might be able to be supported in doing something differently. Some of it may be that it's actually just not a priority. So like I could find time if I wanted to, but it's not a priority. So it's hard to know. There's a lot that's embedded in this. It requires time and energy to change. Content coverage concerns. And content coverage concerns we broke out in 3 ways. So one is it's important to me to get through the syllabus. It's important to me to get through all the material. There's another content coverage concerns that are based on external requirements. So this might be, in order for my students to get transfer credit at the 4-year college, like I need to cover all these topics. Or in order for my pre-med students to succeed on the MCATs, I need to cover all these topics. Institutional expectations had more to do with peer colleagues. Like if I let students move on to second semester without knowing this topic, my peers will get on my case, or there will be ramifications, perceived ramifications. Difficulty getting students engaged. A lot is embedded again in this deficiency model of students, which we can unpack if we want to.
I'm stunned that that's that hot.
40%. So there's lots of things that are embedded in this. Sometimes it's students don't know how to argue. The most confident, bullheaded student will convince the other ones of a wrong answer, and I don't want to let that happen. So some of it's about they don't know how to talk to each other. Some of it is none of the students know the right answer, so what good is it putting them together? There's lots of different things that they think students lack that mean peer instruction is not going to work. And all of those different things that they said students lack, we lump together. Some faculty felt like they had experiences in which peer instruction didn't work. Some people said they didn't have the right resources or the class size was inappropriate. It's interesting, if you unpack class size, there's actually people who say my class is too big, and there's people who say my class is too small to do peer instruction. It's very strange.
Big.
Some people think it's too small because I really don't need to do this because I can just walk around, I can have them do open-ended tasks, and I don't need to do anything like this.
That I've heard. I've never
Some
heard
people
that's
say it's too big, like I could never rein them back in, like when they're talking to each other, like I couldn't circulate enough to actually make sure that they were all on task. I'm saying it more knitted together sometimes than it comes out in interviews, but those are some of the kinds of things that will come up.
I'd just say to add to that, it was surprising my experience is that it can be just as challenging to get a small group of students to talk as it is to get 100 students in a lecture hall.
It'd be harder.
Because there's more, personal risk.
Attention.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
That's why I'm shy.
Trouble finding good questions came up a lot, 30%. Getting student buy-in. And so we ended up separating out getting student buy-in from difficulty getting students engaged. And the difference is this is some more active resistance, like students will sit in the corner and not talk to them even though I keep telling them to, or will actively complain about what we're doing to me or in student evaluations or in other things like that. So then one of the things, go ahead.
Your personal experience one, both on the constraints and the affordances.
Yep.
It could be that could be in my personal experience it didn't work because, and then so the subcategory of the personal experience has to be all the other constraints as well. It didn't work for me because of the class size. It didn't work for me because.
It could be. There are occasions in which one account of why it didn't work could be coded in both. Coded under it didn't work in personal experience because the class was too big or because and it would get doubled.
Okay.
Yeah.
But most of the time, they said these things without having any personal experience. The class is too big for me to use. It's not that they tried it, it didn't work.
Yeah.
They just thought that it was too big.
Right. Yeah. A lot of these are based on people who never have ever tried, and they're just telling you why they think it wouldn't work. Thanks. So then the next thing that we wanted to look at is we wanted to see if the perceived affordances and the perceived constraints vary by their implementation groups. So we looked at these same affordances and constraints. First I'll show you that this is just the beginning part. But so we counted the number of the perceived affordances and perceived constraints that people reported. And so we see that in the high use group, they're reporting far more perceived affordances than they are reporting perceived constraints. And mixed users are reporting about equal numbers, and non-users are reporting far more perceived constraints than they are reporting perceived affordances. And then you can also look across groups. You can see the number of affordances that we see drops as you move to the right across groups, and similarly constraints go up. But the more interesting, I think, thing beyond the just quantitative differences is to look and see if there are qualitative differences in the kinds of constraints and the kinds of affordances that people are focused on. So that's what we did here. So this is showing the top, so the most highly ranked perceived affordances within each group, and what's listed are every reason that got more than 50% of that group in it. Looking at the percentages can be a little bit misleading because we do have low numbers. So the numbers are given here. So this is only 7, this is 18, and this is 10. But one of the big things you see again, the differences in numbers, that there's far more people, individual people reporting perceived affordances than they are perceived constraints. And we see some interesting qualitative differences in what show up here. So the most prevalent perceived constraints for high users are things like difficulty getting students engaged and trouble finding good questions. And again, we see that these are largely having to do with issues of implementation, like things you may not even realize are complicated until you start doing it. For the mixed users, we see things like the time and energy required to change and a personal commitment to content coverage. And we see far more perceived constraints on the non-user side. Time and energy required to change, student deficiencies. Of people in this non-use group, 60% of them are reporting the reason I'm not doing peer instruction, or one of the constraints is that students lack some skill or ability or content knowledge to do it successfully. A personal commitment to content coverage, structural constraints, my current practices are effective, or there's external requirements of content coverage.
Chandra, could you just review this interview group was this mixed group, right?
So right now our mixed group is just here in the middle. This is the mixed group.
It's a mixed group of users, high, mixed, and non.
Yeah, say it again.
Well, so I'm just a little confused about which group you're interviewing. You showed that first graph that rated people 1 through 9, and so you had the non-users, the full users, and the mixed users.
Exactly.
Those three groups are these three, or?
Yeah, those three groups are these three. So these are the people using 7 to 9 features. These are the people using 1 to 6, and these are the people using none.
So you interviewed them all. I somehow have the impression you were just interviewing mixed users.
No, I interviewed all of them. Yeah.
But they're not separate. Does it look any different without self-reported? Like I'm a non-user, but
I haven't done the analysis. I have a feeling it does actually by self-reported group that there's still variations. I don't know if they'll come out this clean or if they'll come out exactly the same. But that's something we should look at too.
I love this.
Yeah, it's really nice.
And so one of the things I think is interesting is that for a lot of people who are both in the mixed group and the high group, they are already convinced that traditional lecture doesn't work. So if you have an audience and the majority of your audience are these people, like you're kind of, maybe potentially in some ways, wasting your breath because you're preaching to the choir to keep talking about how traditional instruction doesn't work. And so these people, the non-users, like they maybe need to hear that, or maybe like we need to figure out how to still talk to them specifically about that. But for these people, it's probably not the best use of our time because they already report to believe that. We also wanted to just note that we see evidence of effectiveness, personal experience showing up for both high and mixed users, but we don't see it showing up for non-users and mixed users. So lots of people think that one of the primary mechanisms by which we get faculty to try is by showing them data, and that that's actually one of the primary drivers. And we see that the reason of personal experience actually comes up often more commonly than evidence of effectiveness from data.
But it's a little curious. So of the 10 non-users, half of them said that they have evidence of effectiveness.
So I think this is more people not who...
so they personally know that it works, but they just choose not to do it.
And it may not be the
It takes
whole
too much
strategy, it may be an element of the strategy. So maybe I think peer discussions are useful because they worked for me in grad school, and I think they'd be useful for my students. And so some of those people think class time is not the best time for that. It should happen outside of class. It's a combination of lots of small ideas. And it's interesting, like I think there are other positive reasons that come up, they just happen to be a smattering of things that are not highly prevalent on average in the group.
I just think those top two most prevalent constraints are so important.
Yeah.
As to really starting to investigate the differences between people who are users and not, that are maybe more nuanced and deep than some of the almost all the other stuff up there.
And we think that kind of this qualitative research in combination with the survey research is interesting and points to a similar thing, which is that we aren't really supporting people. Once they've started trying, we aren't really supporting people in the new kinds of problems that come up once you're trying to do innovative things. Okay.
I just,
Yeah.
real quick, I want to, this difficulty of getting students engaged versus student efficiencies, is that totally different from each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to answer your question the best, I should actually look at the overlap, like how many people actually we coded, double coded as saying student efficiencies and students.
Well,
Usually,
it could be like I have trouble getting students engaged versus, you know, like students are not capable of being totally engaged. You know?
I think that is that is a large difference in how we would have coded it. If they say, you know, students are engaged because they lack the ability to focus on one thing for more than 5 minutes, like we would put that under deficiency, student deficiency. But if they say, I have difficulty getting my students to engage because like some people are reticent to talk to each other, I think that we would put that under deficiency, students engaged. Or I always
isn't a deficiency.
Right. Or I have trouble, there's always 5 students who I struggle to get involved, or I struggle to get talking to each other. Yeah, I guess it's interesting that those might be different sides of a similar coin. Where does the responsibility lie for a similar observation? Yeah. Okay, any other questions on this one? Okay. So there's a few things that we just thought we'd just conclude with, but one is that the name of this innovation doesn't have like a consensus meaning. People have different meanings of what peer instruction means to them. Some of these people have very literal interpretations. It means whenever I get students talking to each other or tutoring each other, that's peer instruction. And other people have very detailed, I've read Mazur's book and have very detailed meanings of peer instruction. And so, I mean, it's just good to be aware of that it's very difficult to communicate effectively about these innovations. It's also difficult to use self-reports as user or non-user to mean something. And it's interesting to note that this is a large way in which a lot of our NSF grants still evaluate dissemination, is how many people on a survey say that they use or say that they don't use. Another claim is that we see that different types of users perceive different affordances and constraints concerning the innovation. And this was in the case of peer instruction specifically, but one size may not fit all when it comes to professional development. Depending on who you're talking to, you might want to address different concerns that people might have. One common barrier to change is that faculty are struggling to find time and energy to change. And again, like we said, there's a lot that's hidden in this. It's a sentiment that hides a lot of interesting systematic and personal prioritization. So more research, we think, is needed to unpack what's meant when faculty say time and energy to change. What is it about, and how do we support faculty in dealing with it? Concerns about content coverage are prevalent and have a variety of sources. Some people have a sort of personal attachment to the material that we're supposed to cover in introductory mechanics. And you know, professional societies or like local teams of faculty could try to actually address this together and give more guidance, explicit guidance on this. So just a few more like implications. So more support is needed to sort of ensure successful implementations. There's lots of people that are getting derailed at every point in that innovation decision process. But the biggest loss is at this discontinuation after trying. So many people, once we convince them that to be familiar, and once we convince them that it might be worth trying, we're losing about a third of people dropping out at that point. We see that New Faculty Workshop is highly successful in developing knowledge and at getting people to try, but it's not correlated with continued use. In some ways, this suggests that maybe our community hasn't really figured out how to support people in continuing use and moving between low and high use. So ongoing professional development is likely important. We found that attendance to talks and workshops are related to teaching was significant at each step in this change process. And we saw that we had concerns of different types of users, so they're not all the same. So if we start thinking about how to support teachers along the way, it's likely that we would have to modify our interventions based on the kinds of people that we're interacting with.
Do you have anything to tell us why people discontinue the innovation? Why is there suddenly a drop-off point?
We will. So the perceived constraints. What we did is a lot of the reasons that come up will be the same as these, but we've coded whenever people in interviews explicitly tied the reason to a concrete action like abandoning. We've coded that, but we don't have it synthesized yet. So we will have something to say about that, but we don't yet.
Really?
Yeah.
So this isn't a question, but rather a comment.
Okay, sounds good.
Which a lot of you saw sort of my initial talk for the FF per Puget Sound, where I was sort of trying to draw some corollaries between what we're doing in physics education research and say, the communications going out about climate change or other things, which are very targeted to specific audiences, and they know very much what the different audience responses are to different messages and how we can learn from that. And what you guys are offering here is like exactly the kind of thing that I was calling for in that talk at Puget Sound, just because I was really saying we need to know so much more about our audience so we can tailor our message, and it sounds like you're thinking about that a lot while you're putting together this data, so just kudos. It's exactly what I want to see.
That's cool. I mean, unfortunately, one aspect that we don't have a lot of information about is like the different communication avenues. Like we've looked at which ones are more prevalent, but we don't know. We don't have a lot to say about how they're interpreting those messages, except that like the meaning of the word peer instruction has multiple interpretations. But we don't know like if some types of pitches would be more or less effective yet. But I think that those calls. I mean, some of our work is useful for that, but I think that even more research is probably needed.
But like you said, the people who are already sold, for instance, on the idea that traditional lecture isn't effective, I think that we probably do repeat that message in fire a lot, and we're wasting our breath when we could be talking about implementation difficulties.
Yeah. Yep.
So on that last slide, you talked about personal experience. It doesn't work. Do you know what faculty mean by that? By what does work mean? Like what does it mean when somebody says peer instruction doesn't work? Like is that an implementation issue? Is it a learning issue? Is it an outcomes issue?
My impression, but I would have to go back and unpack the examples more to say, but my impression is that it's more, I ask my students to talk to each other, and they just they wouldn't talk to each other.
Okay, so
it could be
that's an implementation. Yeah, and I would be really curious because I hear this
I'll
a
look
lot.
That up. I'll get back to you.
People say it doesn't work, and then when I ask them what that means, people actually aren't always so good at articulating what they mean by it. Just didn't work.
My recollection of it was that I don't recall anyone having a very specific reason for why. I mean, it's hard to say because we're based on memory back from them, but they seem to be more general, like, my students didn't like it, I didn't like it, didn't feel right, whatever. But a lot of times they were implementing it badly. They weren't.
Well, that's where I want to go eventually. Is what does it mean when peer instruction doesn't work? When we know that it can work.
Right.
So, and presumably we also know that it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
I mean.
So that's actually, I think that part of what you're interested in is what led us to decide what the next theme that we want to take on. So we're going to look across all the interviews about how faculty talk about assessment, and so how they talk about assessing teaching effectiveness. So how they personally go about trying to assess it, and how their universities go about assessing them of it. And so we do have a lot of faculty who use very informal and non-systematic ways of deciding whether or not instruction is working, like whether or not students are nodding, or have the hazy look in their eyes, or and we have some people using the FCI. I mean, informal and using the FCI. So we're starting to look at that more systematically. Yeah.
Do you have any information about how many schools do what we do, namely we put new professors through apprenticeship, they're lieutenants before they become primary lecturers, so that they're not just thrown in the deep end, they go through some kind of training process with the more mature.
So we didn't ask that specifically, like did you have an experience like this, but we did ask them, does your institution or department support you in changing the way you teach? And so I would guess that if they had them and they felt like they helped them in changing their teaching, that they would bring them up then, but we didn't explicitly say, were you apprenticed or did you get a mentor, a teaching mentor?
Co-teaching.
Yeah.
I don't even know how common that is here to you, or you do it in our department.
Yeah, we don't always do it in our department.
Who would ever call for co-teaching? Charles wrote his
Ben?
thesis.
So were there any hints about what a good support program would look like for one of these innovations?
For implementation, like supporting
Yeah, like if
implementation?
you're calling for support like after
Yeah.
they know about it
Right.
and start using it.
We have some hints, I think, in that when people say trouble finding good questions, a lot of faculty are writing their own questions. And so we have a lot of evidence in our interviews that we're working to characterize that people tinker and modify and cut and paste things together a lot. And so I think that is a kind of activity where PER hasn't given them a lot of guidance on, like, how did Mazur write the questions that he wrote and what makes them good or bad, and how would someone who's trying to write them themselves do that well. And so, I mean, that might be true for a lot of innovations besides peer instruction. What makes a good activity, and how do we understand what makes a good activity? I don't know if you guys have more to add.
Well, I think they don't. I think the part they don't want to spend the time to write all the new questions, but they recognize that the Mazur questions are limited, or they're pitched to a certain audience that aren't their audience, or they're not covering what they want to cover, and they're out on the web trying to find additional sources, and they're just not finding. Like, they don't want to write them themselves. They recognize that if other people can sometimes give them better ideas, and they're looking for that.
I think the other more general thing is, I mean, they talked in the interview about a lot of things that just didn't work, I couldn't get the students to talk to each other, there were too many student complaints, I couldn't get through the content quickly enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a whole slew of these things that, if you listen to Mazur's talk, he doesn't talk about that stuff, or he makes it sound really easy. Oh yes, I can get through the same content. You have to you have to spend 10 minutes the first day in class to tell people how important this is, and then they buy into it right away.
Right.
And that's hardly ever the way that it works out. So there's expectations that are built up in that kind of presentation, that when the faculty run into these barriers, that then they're, oh wow, that's not how I was sold on this, and so they weren't ready for it.
So I definitely think that we have ideas about problems that faculty are encountering that you might want to target and discuss how you might address in a professional development, but like what the professional development would look like itself, like less concrete ideas from the interviews.
Well, let me play counterpoint to that, which is something good is happening at the new faculty workshops, right? So that's doing a lot to get people to try it and get people engaged in that. So there are also some hints of kinds of activities that work along the way. I'm sensitive to time here. We're running right up at 2 o'clock, and then lots of other issues. We haven't even talked about promotion or tenure yet, but I'm sure that's high on the list of you guys to change. So let's thank the speakers.